Yeah, yeah, and you might need to pull that pretty close.
Yeah. So, welcome. It's sunny and a Friday afternoon. So, but I would say we're around the world, we have the right people to have a strong conversation about some of the important questions in this relationship. I want to talk some of the questions and turn things over to my colleagues here and the wider group. It's my place. I've taught at Georgetown for a long time, since 17. My privilege to get to study called the Americas Forum, which allows me to put together things such as this periodically. But for today is, within the series Mexico, Mexicans, and the United States, Inseparable Challenges. And you'll note there are sheets around. There are 2 more events coming in April, and we recommend anyone who would like to please come and join us then. Our 2 presenters today, I'm going to introduce everybody now so we won't be breaking for introductions along the way. So we will open with Enrique Cárdenas. Enrique, I'm going to be brief, but he has a long CV of accomplishments. He holds a PhD in economics from Yale. He taught at a long list of distinguished Mexican universities, rising to become president of the University of the Americas for a lengthy period in the 90s. He has since then taught at many universities, founded the, I don't know what you want to call it, an NGO think tank combination called Signo Vitales, which addresses key issues in Mexican life and politics. And he is author of so many works on the historical political economy of Mexico, but wonderfully culminated in a book that has become a guiding light to me. It's called La larga trayectoria del curso, breve, largo curso de la economía mexicana desde 1780 a nuestros días. And Nuestros Días was when it was published in 2015. So it is really a pivotal long-term study. And what I can simply say, whenever I have worked on my long-term studies, it becomes my handy Bible. When I want to check out what's going on in the world of political economy, I know where to turn. And he has, I was going to flash this, so I will. Sorry, I can have that. He has recently published a short, accessible volume simply called The Mexican Economy. And I recommend it 2022, recent, up to date, if anybody wants a guide to such things. So I want to welcome Enrique. We will open first. We will have conversation about his presentation, and then we're going to turn to Mary Beth Sheridan at my right. She is best known these days as the Mexico City bureau chief for the Washington Post. She has in fact been a journalist in many parts of the world, but has repeatedly returned to Mexico and Central America, where she works on, well, you see in her presentation, labor reforms, environmental challenges, trade, so many issues. But I need to share, because Enrique and I go back knowing each other as scholar. I want to share. First of all, that Mary Beth and I share undergraduate studies at the Jesuits Holy Cross College. But beyond that, I am to either be blamed or credited for her ability to have gone there. So I need to tell the tale of being in the class of 1969, and we took it as our task to lobby the Jesuits to finally go co-ed. And we fought for a year to get women admitted. In that fight, a good friend of mine was the editor of The Crusader, the weekly college newspaper, and he gave to me the right to do the weekly masthead quote. And my favorite quote for the year, again, the fight was for co-ed. The quote was, "Day after day, alone on a hill." We won the battle, even the war in the long run. But Holy Cross made sure there would be no women on campus until after we had long departed and long graduated. But it is just doubly joyful for me to welcome Mary Beth, who took advantage of what we fought for and has had a wonderful career as a journalist. And that I also want to introduce briefly Alejandro Werner, who's at the corner of the table over there. He is the director of the Americas Institute, of which our Americas Forum is under the umbrella program, we will call it. And more to the point today, he is formerly the head of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the International Monetary Fund. So he had quite a career engaging the very issues we're looking at today. And so I have wanted to welcome him as a, shall I say, conversationalist in our participation today, and also thank you and all your staff for the support. So I will begin and pass the floor to Enrique. We probably can pass him the microphone, and you for our opening presentation.
Well, thank you very much, John, for the introduction and invitation to this forum, and thank you very much to all of you for being here. What I would like to talk today is the difficult interaction between two very integrated economies with very diverging societies, and how that creates a lot of tension between the two countries, and how that could be perhaps a bit diminished in the future. So that's the idea of the talk. Okay. Right. Oh, okay. Magic. All right. So the idea is to talk a little bit about how integrated the two economies are. I will go very briefly on that. Then some of the issues I see as very important in this specific situation of divergent societies, and then how the neighborhood could be in terms of relations and implications of that for the future, and some of the challenges ahead. So first, of course, we know that Mexico and the US, Mexico has been very dependent on the US for a long, long time, since the 19th century, but mostly in trade. But Mexico was not important for the United States. Today, Mexico is important to the United States in terms of trade. It's become one of the largest partners, and that's because of NAFTA, as you know. So if one looks at exports and imports and the structure of that, Mexico and Canada have become really the major trade partners. Mexico's manufacturing depends a lot on US manufacturing. That is, the two economies are intertwined. If you can follow almost the same path from the manufacturing sector in the US and the manufacturing sector in Mexico. They move along almost perfectly. Indeed, Mexico wants to export, we need to import. We need to import a lot of things. That, along with flexible exchange rates, really has prevented in the last 20 years balance of payments crisis, as Alejandro knows very, very well. Mexico and the US have not only become integrated, but Mexico's economy, exports and economy as such, has become also very complex. Actually, it's according to Harvard Growth Lab, it's the 22nd most complex economy in the world, and even by far more complex than any other country in Latin America, but even more complex than Spain, Poland, Russia, and others. These two images can give you an idea. This is Brazil and Mexico's structure of exports by the same Harvard Growth Lab. And you can see the different sorts of goods and commodities that the two countries export. And Brazil's would be mostly on vegetables or agricultural products and some mining products. That would be the bunch really of the exports. Whereas in Mexico's case, you see more manufacturing, of course, cars, metallurgic, and other goods. So it's really amazing, surprising. I mean, for many of us, even coming from Mexico, that is the case. So in addition to that, of course, we have, as you know, long and close border, access by sea and land, a strong border economy. California and Texas are two of the most exporting states in the US, and they export a lot to Mexico. Labor market integration is there, maybe not documented all the time, but there is a lot of that. Capital and financial markets are almost free. You know, they flow very easily from one country to the other. And the Mexican peso is one of the 10 top trading currencies in the world. So indeed, it's amazing how, in that sense, NAFTA really has created that sort of thing. Well, what does that imply for the future, for an economy like Mexico's? First, of course, the possibility to increase value added into our exports. Today, it's only about 40% of the exports are domestically produced. In nearshoring, there has been a lot of talk about that. Prosperity will improve competitiveness and growth. And of course, more regional trade and exchange that could include many other services that are not necessarily included so far. So the potential there is very, very strong. And for the US also is strong, the potential to have a better interrelationship. First, a secure source of certain materials and commodities, goods and services. The supply chains closer to the United States now with the difficulties around the world, but especially having a prosperous neighbor that will imply less migration and a larger market for the US economy as well. So that and a competitive and capable labor force would necessarily increase US labor productivity and productivity and growth in the United States. So there's something to be gained by the United States as well, not only to Mexico, but also to the US. Now, what about society? I'm going to talk a few things only about this, but I hope this will give you an idea that how difficult it is to assemble both the economy and society. First, let's look at some facts and figures. Well, insecurity has really become the major issue in Mexico now for a long time. The number of homicides is just amazing. You know, it's about 30-something thousand a year. That's a very high rate. Only 2.5% of those felonies are prosecuted. The number of people who have disappeared, men and women, has just, I mean, look at the graph, how that has increased in the last few years. It's amazing. These are disappearances. This is not homicides. This is in addition to homicides. So you can just imagine how bad things are there. Feminicides, that also has been and it continues to be a terrible problem. 2.3 feminicides per day, which is just horrible. And well, what can I say? But not only in security, we have a problem. We also have a problem with governance and basic institutions. The division of power is in decline. The present administration really has made sure to make it less, to attack the judiciary. The frequent attacks are there. The colonization of the Supreme Court is there. I mean, it's normal to have a politically appointed member of the court. That's normal. But one thing is that, and the other is to really, in the most basic issues, not necessarily linked to political issues, to have an opposition, to have a decision that is really not even legal, I would say. Then, of course, these other organs of the state, which are autonomous and which try to restrict overall power in the executive in terms of access to public information, market regulation, sanitary issues, and the free press. And Maribeth is here, and she can tell us much more than that. I am just presenting you a few figures on 2022 by Article 19, which is an organization that follows this data. You can tell, there are the number of intimidations and harassment, threats, illegitimate use of public power, blocking contents of media, and so on and so forth. And of course, assassinations of journalists. It's, I think, we are the country which is not at war with the highest number of journalist assassinations. The democratic institutions, as I said, are also under threat. The Electoral Institute, the Electoral Tribunal, and then the access to public information has been very much curtailed. Actually, Signos Vitales was founded in 2020 when we began to see how the information, official information, was not reliable, and it was becoming less and less, present. So this can give you an idea, these figures there, the number of sites, of government publication sites, environmental, all sorts, that have just been abandoned. 70 sites, 80 sites of major information on the country have been abandoned. Updating in the last 24 months that have not been updated, a good number of them, and so on. And then, of course, organized crime. And that's something that I would like to stress, because even now by, the rule of law in general first, and then organized crime, but the rule of law international index that is done by the World Justice Project ranks Mexico in number 116 out of 142 countries. 1/3 of the territory is really in many ways controlled by organized crime. Extortions, about 8,809 from January to October of 2023. Those are the ones that we know about. Of course, we don't know of many others which never come to light. But this is a problem that has increased enormously. And of course, corruption. So if you look at the map here that the World Justice produces, you see that Mexico really in that number 116. Now, the rule of lawless, I say, in organized crime, a recent report just appeared about a week and a half ago, places Mexico as first out of 193 countries. 193, I mean, everybody in the world in criminal markets. That is the specific aspect, criminal markets. That is the economy, how the economy is loaded with international crime. And now, which is now which has become more and more clear in elections, the organized crime in elections. We are every day having new information. There's one today about the participation of organized crime in elections. And in governance in several states and so on. And and it is clear that this is at least tolerated, if not supported by the government today. What does that imply? That implies that there's a lot of money laundering, and the money laundering thing is affecting the lives of many people, the lives of people, and it's affecting the U.S. By this situation as well. How does that happen? Well, of course, first the smuggling of dollars itself, remittances that have increased, has almost doubled in the last 6 years. There is some also fake exports in there is the underwriting of las facturación, subfacturación, and expansion of the cash economy. In 2021, according to the National Institute of Statistics, almost 79% of the transactions above $60 are done in cash. That's not new, but that has not been decreased. And the problem is that I was just telling Alejandro the figure, $1,100 per person in cash is what people have in their pockets on average, or $2,400 by every member of the active population, economic active population. Those are numbers which are just very high. You don't know. I mean, what I'm trying to put in these figures is how the cash economy has just expanded. I was looking at the figures. I don't have the graph here, but the issue of 1,000 peso bills, that is the largest issue, has just flooded the market, the cash on the streets. 326% increase in 3 years, the 1,000 peso bills. But in terms of numbers, 226 million notes. 226 million notes of issue. I don't know, Banco de Mexico, why. I mean, I was telling Alejandro, I mean, what's happening there? They don't see it. They are worried about something else. Don't? But without even probably noticing it, they are making it cheaper for drug lords to carry cash around. So, and again, that's the map. And the other issue that also confronts us as societies, both sides of the border. I mean, remember, I started with economic integration, and now look at this. How can this be living together? And that's not easy, or that's not possible. So if you look at the militarization, which has also overflowed in the last few years, you see how the army is getting much and more money. How, well, I want to stop in this picture. I think this is a very relevant picture. You see López Obrador condecorating the General Cienfuegos, who had been arrested in Los Angeles and then let go by the US government to Mexico. And look at the smile of the person on the left. He is the Secretary of Defense. I think it's very eloquent, this picture, and shows exactly what's going on. Well, the army now controls internal security, who enters and leaves the country, what is traded within and without the country, what goes through customs. They construct and manage airports, trains, and even hotels. There is no public accountability, and of course, there are stories about corruption. And what are the effects of that? Well, just a few there. that's the number of military men who have been deployed for internal security in the last years. And you see the line of the number of homicides. So the best they have done by deploying, almost 100,000 more men on the ground is to stop the increase in homicides, assuming that's correct. So that's the effectiveness of this policy. What I will end here with the divergent societies part of the presentation. I'm just saying that you can add to this other things like economic and social divergence within Mexico and between Mexico and the United States in terms of prosperity, in terms of well-being, and so on. It's 3 times harder for a poor person born in the South to leave poverty than if he was or she was born in the North, for instance. Social mobility is much worse in the South than in the North, 3 times. So poverty and insecurity, and I want to stress insecurity because for me, for a long time we thought about poverty as the main engine for migrants to move. Now, insecurity has also become a factor. And that, of course, creates a lot of tension in the North. So, and that not only happens in Mexico, of course, that's happening in Central America. Here's the number of asylum applications in Mexico, not in the United States, in Mexico from other countries. So even Mexico as it is, how dangerous it is, it's better than where they are, so that they want to move in. So that's, that gives you an idea of how things are. So, well, look at this cartoon. I like this cartoon because it can show more or less what, if we don't do things together, it doesn't work. So, is it desirable to have a good relationship between neighbors? Well, I'd say yes, of course. But does it matter? It does indeed. And is it possible? Well, I think it depends. And let's see what it depends on. First, how can you do this with such diverging situations in both countries? Well, if there are divergent values, you will have those neighbors, pushing garbage on one side to the other. If these values are so different, that will probably happen in terms of democracy, in terms of freedom, in terms of fairness of justice, in terms of the role of the military, and so on. What other implications are there if there's social insecurity, social instability, insecurity, lack of compliance of the rule of law, organized crime controlling life in your neighbor? Well, you will create many forces that will make pressure to your neighbor in terms of migration, in terms of capital flows, in terms of crime on one side and the other of the border. And these are forces that actually will push this involuntary and lawless migration and increase tension between the two. So, in my view, it does pay to have a good relation. So, in other words, our problems are also US problems, and the US problems are also our problems. And for instance, some of the challenges, 860,000 Mexicans were deported from the US just in 23. That deportation had almost disappeared 8 or so years ago. There was almost no net migration in between Mexico and the United States. Now it's just exploded again. And I'm trying to tell you why. These forces of insecurity and situation and economic situation are just doing that. So my question would be, given that the US and Mexico are going to be where they are not moving anywhere, what should we be? Should we be partners? Should we be your political allies, or friends, or distant neighbors? And that's a question we have really to answer. What kind of relationship do we want to have? And I ask also, should the US, Canada, and Mexico should try to adopt a more comprehensive and integrated relationship beyond trade? Because trade is already there with these difficulties, this and that, but it's there. Well, beyond trade. And to include governance, environment, security, and some democratic values. Well, NAFTA did indeed provide a lot of good things for integration, but it could not do everything. It's a trade treaty, that's all. It's not more than a trade treaty. So you cannot ask, as we say in Spanish, manzanas, no puedes pedir peras al olmo, decimos. Some possibilities. The construction of trilateral agencies that could get into customs, for instance. A trilateral agency in customs, that is US and Mexican authorities working together on the border and making sure that weapons don't go into Mexico and fentanyl doesn't come into the United States. You know, working together but institutionally. Also in sanitary oversight, for instance, having US sanitary oversight in Mexican customs or airports in Mexico so that they can come to the US without a problem, environmental protection, water security. So agencies of a trilateral way with attributes, that is with power, could be good. We have some experience with NAFTA, as you know, with a dispute resolution situation, but there will be some. These are just some ideas. Illegal versus orderly migration have temporary visas, working permits, as there are already with Mexico, maybe more, and Mexico with Central America. Energy and environment, develop agreements to hold similar standards and rules of the game in the whole energy production and distribution sectors. Even some things which may not be, apparently are not important, but imagine, for instance, the same road signs, the same road standards for trucks to go from one place to the other, the same standards in different things, so that we begin to go beyond trade and start really looking at each other as real partners. Common pension treatment, and there are many other proposals like integrate qualified labor flows, expand professions to be included in under the NAFTA protocol, infrastructure development at networks across the three countries, expand financial resources and eligibility of projects for a North American bank, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are possibilities here and there. So I would say that the choice is ours. But to turn our side to the other side, to turn, voltear al otro lado, is really not going to solve the tension between both countries. And it is our own interest, I think, to work together really institutionally and creating a much better relationship between neighbors. And what are the corollary of this? We both have elections this year. You have in the US tremendous challenge, I think, of a different sort, but not at some point so different, between Trump and Biden, maybe, or Democrats and Republicans. I will leave you there. I'm not an expert at all, so I won't talk about that. But between Sheinbaum and Galvez, Xochitl Galvez, I think it's a clear choice. There is no hidden agenda. Like with Trump, there's no hidden agenda. You know how he's like. You know exactly the same here. You know what she will do. Many people want to believe that she will be different. She won't. Let me tell you, she won't. I don't think so. I would put my hand on fire for saying that. So the choice is very clear. And now with the president just sent some initiatives to Congress to be approved, constitutional changes, and that's the roadmap for the future, which has been embraced by her candidate. now you know exactly what that means. That means the destruction of the judiciary power. That means the destruction of the balance of power, centralization of power, the militarization of the still more militarization, and of course, the continued deals with organized crime. That's the future there. And it's very clear to me. That's my opinion. And of course, in the case of Sochi, it's a different way. It's something completely different. More in the lines of what I am proposing. Okay. That's what I have to say. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
And we would love to open the floor to questions, comments, conversation, and contributions. We will have, as soon as we sort of set this up, their microphones can be shared around to speak. And I would like to offer Alejandro Werner, who comes with an expertise beyond most of the rest of us, particularly on the economic side of this, to open the conversation.
Thanks, John, and thank you, Enrique. I mean, this was a great presentation and very wide-ranging and touching upon many topics. No, I mean, the first one, I like your focus on institutional divergence that has taken place between Mexico and the US in the last 5 years. Maybe we converge in the wrong direction in the next 4 years, no? So convergence is not always good. At least we would like to have one of the two neighbors maintaining the strengths of their institutions. But what I was trying to get at, I mean, I think we can also look at many other dimensions in where there might be we might be achieving at least some convergence. I think both societies, I mean, I guess we have many more US citizens living in Mexico now than what we used to have 20 years ago. I think we have a much more fluidity between people that are staying 2-3 years in the US, going back to Mexico, and Americans that we have a much larger degree of US capital invested in Mexico and US businesses invested in Mexico. Tourism in both directions, I think, also has deepened. So it's such a complex relationship, and I think in many dimensions, outside governments and policies, it has strengthened a lot, and it has and I think even culturally, we have converged on many things. But so it would be nice to and given politically what Mexico is going through, I understand what people are focusing a lot on what you focus, but maybe it would be nice to listen from you, maybe to expand the idea of convergence on divergence, both on the economy, socially, culturally, etc., on more dimensions. But I totally agree with you, and we were discussing this before you started, that in terms of policies, we have moved to, I think, to an equilibrium in which there's not that much willingness to work together in solving bilateral problems. On some aspects, I think on both sides of the border, I mean, the USMCA, it's a free trade agreement signed between two governments that don't believe in free trade. They like their autonomy to set policies. They like the controversies on energy, on some foodstuffs, on local content on automobiles, etc. So it's a much more complex and antagonistic relationship from the policy point of view, even if we move ahead, because we know we have to have an agreement because we are integrated and that we will not break. But with that constraint, I think we all, when we signed NAFTA, both countries actually were looking forward to build upon NAFTA a much deeper integration. And I think from the policy and the government side, this is not the case, and I think you're totally right. I would also, however, there's some specific issues in which that are very important for both governments, that maybe there's a scope for further deepening of policies. I think security and the environment are two of them. Hopefully, I mean, maybe you could expand a little bit on those. I think recently there was a guy, a security expert, Eduardo Guerrero, who wrote about the logic and how a bilateral security agreement should be designed and negotiated. And also, I mean, in 2 years, the new free trade agreement, the USMCA, has this renegotiation clause, or at least review clause. So what should be there? How Mexico should prepare for that? It would be nice to listen to any ideas that you have in that on that front. And then I would like to hear your views. You started with the complexity argument and the complexity indexes that Ricardo Hausmann has put together, and then you jump and you say Mexico is a complex economy. Exports. But my question is, do you know if there's more Mexican complexity in Ford Fiesta, or whatever the models that are now done by Ford are called, than in an Argentinian soybean? I really don't know. I mean, maybe you can have a lot of R&D made by Argentinians on the soybean, and maybe in Mexico we do brakes and we have local content, but I don't know if we have that much value added generated in Mexico, and even complex value added. There might be a lot of genetic stuff being done in agriculture that it's embedded, and this. So in that sense, I think, and I'm not criticizing at all what you said, but I'm criticizing a little bit more using complexity, as maybe Hausmann does, a little bit lightly in terms of showing that one economy is much more sophisticated than other, no? And maybe it's the case of Mexico, and maybe that's our challenge, to use NAFTA to sophisticate our production and our services industries, etc., much more. And maybe we have not done it, and why should we do it? No, or how should we do it? And finally, just to close on a comment, I think you're look. I mean, having money in circulation being 15% of GDP, it's nuts. And you didn't show the time trend, but I'm pretty sure it has been increasing. So yeah, I mean, everybody supposedly should be paying by phone, etc. So bills should be disappearing, and it seems that so something is going on, might be correlated with the remittances, and remittances might be correlated with organized crime, etc., etc. It's a very interesting fact. I mean, the central bank doesn't have a mandate to fight organized crime. So what those guys are doing are minimizing the cost of giving the bills that the population wants. And the population is demanding many 500 peso bills. So they say, well, I cut the cost by half by issuing $1,000 bills. So that's what they're doing. But yeah, they were maybe not thinking or addressing the issue of, is this, can I impose a tax on criminal activities, but significantly increasing the cost of managing cash? And I think maybe we should be, because I don't know, I mean, is the $1,000 bill circulating in Mexico, or people are hoarding it? So I think the Central Bank of Mexico needs to find a way to distinguish between the demand for different bills for transactional purposes from the demand of bills as a store of value. And if you're storing value with bills, is because you don't want to go where you should be storing value, that is the banking system. So you should not be providing that product to society, no? So I think you have a point, and it would be nice to maybe to think how Banco de Mexico should look at this issue and eventually at least impose another tax on the bad guys on how to they handled cash. And finally, what's the future of the? I mean, you say that under a shame-bound government we will continue to see institutional decay and democratic backsliding, etc. Do you have any idea of how the Mexican political system will what the opposition would look like after the election? The opposition, a lot of people are focusing on what will happen in Congress. Independently of the result of the election, do you think that de facto the opposition representatives will be orphans in 2025, and therefore easily captured by the government, and therefore even if they don't get it, if the government doesn't get a constitutional majority de facto, they will build it pretty quickly? Or do you think that the opposition will regroup and we will see, if there's at least at the legislative level a solid result for the opposition, we will continue to see an opposition that will present at least an important break to this process that you mentioned that will continue under a Sheinbaum administration?
So much to contemplate and think about. And if anyone didn't see how complex these challenges are between the two presentations, it is clear. Would you want to make a brief response?
Sure, or if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, and then we can open up some further conversation.
Well, just to address a couple of points, Alejandro. Certainly, Eduardo Guerrero is a very knowledgeable person in security, and I don't know the details of his plan or his proposal, but I'm sure that there are ways in which, if both countries want, maybe they are, as you say, protectionist, and they still have to deal with trade. But if there's a will to really look at this in the long run and diminish these tensions, I think that an institutional, a proper framework would help in preventing, what has been going on. The example of the Customs Trilateral Agency, for instance, or the example of the roads and the environment in the environment, trilateral agreements with the agencies in the environment, I think could be crucial. And that, it seems to me, will help build these a different ambience for collaboration. But they need to want to do it, of course, and I don't know if they will want. But given the situation, what I'm trying to say is, if they don't want, this will continue and continue and continue. The tensions will continue increasing, in spite of the fact that, and I think you're right, culturally, there have been, there is a lot of interaction. Socially, there is a lot of interaction. But it's hard to imagine yourself in the neighborhood, and you have your neighbor, where they kill each other, or they mistreat the other person. They shout all the time. It's not nice. It is anyway. So they need to want to do it. In terms of the complexity, I think you're right. I don't know how good these indices are, but what I think what they show is at least the diversity, or in that sense complexity, rather than maybe complexity inside. What I mentioned, I think, in the presentation was that only 40% of the content of exports is really produced in Mexico. And so it's a small percentage, and maybe through there we could have a much integrated situation and much better possibilities in the future. As for the cash, yes, I think there is an issue there, and I will finish now with the opposition. It's hard to say what will happen, but what this government has proven, I think, is that he has been capable of destroying a lot of things. Not always with a change in the constitution, but he has been able to push in the Supreme Court for years when Saldívar was there, to put in the backlog some of the changes so that they wouldn't be unconstitutional. For instance, the army in the domestic security, the president of the Supreme Court did not present that, to be discussed for 2 years or 3 years. And so by that time, of course, the military were already on top of things. They already took it, in fact. And so what I'm trying to say is that even if they don't have the majority in Congress, they still have a lot of power to do things. And so in that sense, I'm not that optimistic. So if it's only the Congress that the opposition manages not to have a very small minority, well, there will be maybe a bit more of a fight, but it will not be easy. So I think this election is crucial. And so, sorry, I'm not very optimistic.
And from a historian's perspective, predicting the future is the one impossibility. But let me open the conversation to others who'd like to contribute, ask a question, etc. Please. Yes, and introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you so much. I'm Esteban. I'm a graduate student here in the Master of Latin America Studies. I'm trying to focus a little bit of the corruption side in the narco traffic problem, because it seems to me that we are facing this failed war on drugs. And one of the questions that we have last year with a journalist, Penile Ramirez, she was here precisely this same area, is precisely how we prosecute for the side of the United States, because we prosecute in the side of Mexico or in Colombia, but who is making prosecutions to the militaries or the officers that are corrupted, because we are facing a global business that are harming a lot of people. What are your thoughts on what could resolve this problem?
No, let me answer in a different way. In my view, organized crime in the country has become so widespread, and they have diversified their business. Drug trafficking is just only one aspect of the whole thing, and maybe not even the most important one. It has become really extortion, charge for cobro de piso. It has become a minorista, a minorista business, a retail business. So it has to do more with institutions and the fact that people can live well, that in the middle of that mess, and that of course is the backbone of other drug trafficking, and which really impacts, of course, other countries. So what to do with, for instance, to deal with these delinquents? It's again institutional building, police development, and so on. I mean, you have to do the work, the institutional work, and the training of the policemen, and the good payments for the policemen, and all that. We know the answers. We know the answers, and the thing is to reverse the trend that I showed you, to reverse that trend, and it will take years in the best of cases. In that sense, I am a bit pessimistic, because I know it's going to take years. I said I was pessimistic. In a way, I'm not that pessimistic, because I think that, and I will say this, I believe that the Mexican population treasures the right to vote, the possibility to vote. People that seem to be apathetic, but on the day of the election, people go out and vote. And my perception is that there is a lot of anger in the Mexican people across groups, that we may have a surprise in June, that the possibility for the opposition to win is much larger than what polls are saying today. That's my impression. In that sense, I am optimistic. I truly believe that that can happen. But if that doesn't happen, and the corruption continues, that needs to be stopped. In other words, if we continue with the trend, that's it for a long time, for decades to come. That's the kind of importance of this election.
No. Yes.
The common market was a source of inspiration to create NAFTA. Is it time to think about the European Union as a source of inspiration for North American Union and to start very small, perhaps?
That's something I would love to. I mean, I don't think it's going to be something like the European Union, but I am convinced by, and I'm sure you are as well, by having lived, for instance, in Spain. Not many people know that Spain and Mexico had the same GDP per person in 1950. Today, it's the ratio is 3-1, and a lot of that has to do with institutional framework and not only money, but rules and abiding by the rules. I was telling about transportation this morning with Maribel, and that, it looks like irrelevant, the signage, that it should be the same. But it's that kind of thing that makes, that people are pushed into more order, so to speak. I believe that kind of situation would be very good. So that's what I was talking about, trinational agencies, fully trinational agencies that could take care of certain topics more and more and deal with the problems, because that could be very helpful to Mexico. Very, very helpful. Yes, I will go that way.
Anything else? Yes, Victoria.
Dr. Cardenas, thank you for your presentation. I mean, in your words, you said we have to stop looking the other way to solve these issues. But it seems, particularly as of late, the United States is intent on looking the other way, particularly with the war in Gaza and the invasion of Ukraine. So I'm wondering what you think is the way to get the United States' attention, because it's not the first time throughout history that the United States has turned away from the importance of Mexico in its foreign relations, because there's other world conflicts going on. So how do we actually put these issues on the table?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe they are on the table. I mean, migration is right on the table today. And it may be the major topic in the US election, right? Or one of the major ones. And perhaps that's the opportunity. As I said, people, I was telling Maribeth this morning, I mean, those people are coming through Mexico from Central America. They have increased a lot in numbers, right? Well, now, almost non-Salvadorans. There are no Salvadorans. Only from Honduras, even Costa Rica, but not from El Salvador. And I'm not saying I am for Bukele's method, but what I am saying is that insecurity really is a major push for migration, for displacement. So if people, it's a very sensitive topic, and maybe the way to take advantage of it, as you say, is well, let's solve this issue really, how it should be solved. And insecurity is one of them. And criminal law, organized crime, that kind of thing is what really is there. So maybe it's a very big opportunity that there is today.
I'm going to step in here, suggest we take about a 2 to 3 minute break. If anyone needs it, there's a restroom in the back. And we're going to swap seats, and Mary Beth will take over and do her presentation. And I suspect we'll complicate these conversations even more. I look forward to it. So we'll resume in a moment.
Okay, well, Don, thank you so much for the invitation and for getting me into Holy Cross. Thank you, Alejandro, and also to the Americas Forum. It's just such an honor to be with such a distinguished group of academics and specialists here. And I wanted to give a special welcome to my mom, who came also. Also distinguished, by the way, that wasn't an exception. She helped me too, she did. So I arrived in Mexico a week before Andrés Manuel López Obrador took office in December of 2018. I was starting my assignment as a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post in Mexico. But I knew the country pretty well. I had worked as a foreign correspondent for the LA Times during in the late 90s, during most of the Cedillo sexenio. I didn't know López Obrador personally, but I was very familiar with his career, of course. Back in the 1990s, he'd been a quite strong opponent of NAFTA. And now he was taking over a country transformed by the treaty, something that I could see firsthand. As I moved into my apartment, I went shopping at Home Depot and Bed Bath & Beyond to pick up my supplies. I had a Walmart Express down the street. I took Ubers and I ordered things from Amazon. None of this existed in the 1990s. Of course, Mexico had begun to open its economy before NAFTA. It entered the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, in the 1980s. But NAFTA has really accelerated that change, as Enrique pointed out. And I'm always struck in conversations, even with very smart sort of internationalists, how often people don't realize that. And I think where that is so amazingly evident is in the political discourse in the US campaign, where Republicans talk about closing the border or invading Mexico to bomb chemical labs and fentanyl labs and so on. And there seems to be very little understanding of actually how much the two countries are knit together. Just this month, official data showed that Mexico had overtaken China as the #1 official source of US imports for the first time in 20 years. Of course, Mexico had already been consolidating its position as the #1 trade partner of the US imports and exports. That's been going on for a little while. You can see it here, the Mexico being the green line. And that was the end of 2022 in this case. AMLO, there was a certain fear, of course, in the business community of him becoming president. And I remember even back in 2006 when he almost won, there was something like panic in sectors of the population that he could turn out to be another Hugo Chavez type figure. But in fact, he's been a surprise as president, I think, in a lot of ways. I think a lot of businesses have actually done quite well under AMLO. Carlos Slim was recently talking about how his fortunes have improved. AMLO, of course, has largely accepted the trade treaty. He was eager for the renegotiation to take place and essentially be wrapped up when he came into office. And exports, of course, have continued to go up. I don't think AMLO had much choice in accepting free trade. In the US, exports amount to around 10% of GDP. In Mexico, that number is 40. And of course, the vast bulk of Mexican exports go to the US. So increasingly, Mexico's different aspects of its economy have become ever more entwined with the US economy. I think there's one of the obvious examples, of course, is the auto industry with parts and vehicles going back and forth. But lately, I've been doing a little work on agriculture, actually, and I'm just fascinated because I think we often don't see what's going on there. But if you drive around Mexico, places like Colima, Michoacan, Jalisco, you just see massive acre on acre of greenhouses. So Mexico now provides 2/3 of US vegetable imports. It makes up half of the fruit and nut imports. And this isn't only because of the free trade agreement, which is important, of course, but the countries are very complementary. I mean, right now, December to April is the berry growing season in Mexico because it's dry. In the summer, when it's rainier, the berries are going to be grown in places like California. So you do see more and more agriculture companies, things like Driscoll Berries, which are sourcing on both sides of the border. And one of the things I've become so intrigued by lately is there's actually a scarcity of farm workers in Mexico. They're all complaining. They really want to start guest worker programs. There's a big effort, not only in agriculture, but it's very notable in agriculture. And one of the reasons is because this sort of intersection of the two economies also does trickle over to labor. There's something like 300,000 Mexicans that now go to the US seasonally with H-2A visas, and another 70,000 go to Canada, more or less. So Mexicans are having to compete really hard with their neighbors to try to get those workers. This is horticultural exports. It's really fascinating. So of course, as I mentioned, I talked about Mexico's exports to the US, but you also see this effect on the US side. Of course, in Mexico, the top agricultural export to the US is beer. That is considered an agricultural product in Mexico. But as the beer exports have gone way up, and now, of course, Mexican beers are the top selling beers in the United States, Modelo Especial. But you've also seen sort of almost in a parallel way, things like malt barley exports to Mexico have just doubled between 2011 and 2021. There's Mexico leading the way with the beer exports. Malt barley comes from places like Idaho and Montana and North Dakota. So sort of the two sides, that the Corona beer is actually really kind of a NAFTA product. It sometimes seems to me it's only when there's a hiccup in trade flows that we actually realize how much the two economies are intertwined. One of those moments came during the pandemic, when each side made its own list, basically, of the industries that were considered essential and therefore allowed to, keep functioning the way they had before. Mexico did not designate its aerospace or defense sectors as essential. So a lot of those factories closed or they were subject to pandemic restrictions. Now that turned out to be a problem for the Pentagon. Mexico has a booming aerospace industry with companies like GE, Honeywell, Lockheed Martin, they all have Mexican subsidiaries. And the Pentagon became so concerned about US defense companies not getting the parts they needed from Mexico that senior officials actually wrote to Mexico's foreign minister and said, please help us get those factories back open. Obviously, I wouldn't want to suggest everything's been rosy for foreign trade under AMLO. He's obviously adopted very nationalist energy policies, and the US and Canada have filed complaints under the USMCA mechanism that he's discriminating against foreign companies, including those who have made green energy investments in Mexico. There's another action under USMCA about corn. This is, again, something the Mexican president has very strong opinions on, both as a symbol of sort of Mexican culture, and he's sort of very suspicious of the whole idea of genetically modified corn. So he would like that not to be imported for human consumption in Mexico. Right now, it's only imported for animal feed, and the U.S. is Mexico's the top purchaser of U.S. yellow corn, which is mostly genetically modified. So that is another one of those disputes that is right now in the USMCA dispute mechanism area. Obviously, another area right now where there's a lot of criticism, I would say, is relating to the nearshoring boom in the wake of the pandemic and the efforts by companies to move closer to their markets. I think a lot of analysts would say Mexico is missing out on a big opportunity by not providing more incentives. Obviously, there's problems of infrastructure. Ports are quite saturated, especially Manzanillo. And then another really big problem is energy. These manufacturers need electricity, and Mexico's distribution networks are not really able to, they're not increasing at a fast enough rate to provide that. AMLO, of course, has been a big fan of fossil fuels. And only recently has the government begun to really embrace the idea of a transition to renewables, but it's going fairly slowly. So that's a quick look at trade relations under AMLO. And to return to the question that was raised at the start of the panel, can this economic integration promote the common good? I think one of the areas where there's been some pretty positive developments are on the labor front. This is a real moment of change for labor in Mexico, and a lot of it has to do with the USMCA. Of course, it was Donald Trump who called for renegotiating NAFTA, but the Democrats in the US Congress were the ones who pushed quite strongly for labor reforms. Mexico for years had suffered from low wages, long hours, sometimes very dangerous work conditions, and NAFTA didn't change that all that much. So unions in the US saw that as a big reason why jobs moved south of the border. What the USMCA did was it really gave momentum to push Mexico to pass a fairly radical new labor law, which guaranteed that workers could choose their own unions in a secret ballot. Now, why was that such a novelty? When I worked in Mexico in the 90s, the country had been a one-party state for about 70 years. And the system, as some of you know, is built very much around the institutional Revolutionary Party. Essentially, it organized Mexico into sort of categories: workers, peasants, the military, and so on, all connected in one way or the other to the party. Part of that was what came to be known as protection unions, which basically worked with the government and with employers to keep wages down and to prevent strikes. So one of the test cases of the new labor provisions of USMCA came not too long after the treaty was signed at a GM pickup factory in the central city of Silao in Mexico. Workers there were represented by the CTM, one of the very big old official labor unions. They made around $2 an hour. So in April 2021, workers had a vote on whether to keep the collective bargaining agreement that had been negotiated by the CTM or throw it out. The election got ugly, and the old union was accused of destroying ballots. The Biden administration stepped in, as it's allowed to do under the new trade treaty, and asked for an investigation. The upshot was that a new vote was held. The workers rejected the contract, and eventually they also ousted the old union. In its place, they chose an independent union, and in 2022, that union ratified its first contract with the GM plant with a wage increase of about 8.5%. The US government has intervened about 20 times since then in similar labor disputes in Mexico under the new treaty. The changes in Mexico's unions go well beyond just the export sector. So I was recently down in Cancun writing a story for the Post, and it was about a campaign to adopt the 5-day work week in Mexico. Imagine in the US, we are talking about the 4-day work week, maybe. The US adopted the 40-hour work week in 1940. It was pioneered some years earlier by Henry Ford. So 84 years later, after the US adopted the 40-hour work week, it's still quite common for Mexicans to work 48-hour work weeks. This is true in a lot of the auto plants, maquiladoras, and many other workplaces, including tourism. In Cancun, of course, most people work in tourism, and the hotels employ obviously massive numbers of people who clean rooms, who work in the kitchens, who serve cocktails, and so on. And if you think about their work weeks, typically 6 days, 8 hours, and then you add their commutes, which are often quite extensive because they can't afford to live near the beachfront hotels, They just spend huge amounts of time working or getting to work. So this is truly, this has really brought people out into the streets in different parts of Mexico. So there's legislation in Congress to institute the 5-day week. As I mentioned, there's been demonstrations in different parts of the country, and unions have been quite active in that, including, interestingly, in Cancun. You can see it's one of the real old-time unions. It's called the CROC, which has organized these demonstrations. And I was just intrigued talking to the regional head of the CROC, how much he talked to me about how things have changed, how union leaders have to actually really appeal to their workers and do things that their workers would like. Otherwise, they won't be elected. They won't get the support of the union members. And I was struck by the fact that of some of the tourism workers I talked to, they seemed fairly, enthusiastic about their union. Here's the workers in the morning waiting for the buses this is just sort of to give you an idea of kind of the very dawn to dusk lives of the workers. So that legislation almost passed. Obviously, López Obrador's party had proposed it. They have a majority. The business community did become quite worried that this was going to be too much of a fast change. And so it got put off probably to the spring votes of Congress. But it was, to me, just a sort of interesting look at how labor is changing and being forced to change by the fact that there's both, workers can actually give them the boot, and presumably because the PRI is no longer much of a force. I think it's worth noting too that López Obrador has been one of the most pro-labor presidents in recent years, and this is when people say, "How on earth can he be so popular?" For people like this who earn minimum wage, there you go. He's doubled the minimum wage, largely managed to do it without contributing that much to overall inflation, from what I understand. He passed a pretty sweeping law that outlaws a lot of the very abusive subcontracting practices that happened and kind of screwed workers out of benefits. He's given Mexican workers in the formal sector, obviously, 12 days a year vacation time, which is double from what they used to have. And that will go up. That's for your first year. And each year after that, it goes up 2 days to 20. So anyway, there's, I think it's an area where that integration has contributed to, some positive outcomes certainly in Mexico. Of course, I think economic integration does not always promote the common good. One of the real areas of concern is the environment. There have been growing concerns that the very intense industrial agricultural practices are overusing water and stressing the environment. I should say, as a parenthesis, one thing that's kind of interesting when we think about industrial agriculture, in the last 10 years, there's been kind of a flip. It used to be that most farm workers in Mexico worked on little family farms. They were not considered salaried workers. Well, now they are. Most Mexican farm workers get salaries. They're no longer kind of working on their tiny little plot. It's a different world. NAFTA has transformed agriculture, I would say. However, this industrialized form of agriculture is obviously causing problems in different parts of the country. Probably one of the most noteworthy is avocados. Obviously a huge Mexican export, very successful in terms of sales and marketing. But farmers this is in Michoacan, of course, the main state where avocados come from. They have increasingly cut down pine forests to plant avocados. This is not technically allowed, but they do it anyway, often with the help of organized crime. The avocados need a lot more water than pine trees, and you really are getting a huge amount of stress on water supplies. And they're also diverting water from people who grow kind of tomatoes and corn and more some of the traditional crops. Obviously, you've seen public demonstrations. I mean, the water crisis is getting really bad in Mexico right now. I mean, Mexico City, a city that's obviously in poor neighborhoods had water problems for a long time. But this year, for the first time ever in Lomas, there were shortages of water, Condesa shortages of water. I mean, even the parts of the city that had sort of lived a bit oblivious to that problem because of drought and because of climate change, it's becoming very intensive. So one of the beer, this very successful Mexican export, that has also drawn a lot of criticism. Places like Heineken, Anheuser-Busch, Constellation Brands, they all have big plants in the north of Mexico to serve the U.S. market. And the drought has been so bad, and the kind of blowback from people in places like Monterrey has been so bad that at one point, AMLO even said, I'm going to stop beer production in the north, which he didn't do. But, there certainly, because of protests, he did get behind a referendum in Mexicali in 2020 as Constellation was building a big new factory. He supported a referendum. People said no, and Constellation had to stop, building that plant. And I should point out, just in favor of the beer people, that they point out that agriculture actually uses 75%, the other agriculture. So they claim that they become much more water efficient and they're unfairly targeted and so on. So I think, another area where you certainly see the impact on the environment is very intensive tourism development in Quintana Roo. Sadly, is having a real impact on, coral reefs and so on. So looking toward the future, I think it's clear when we look at the two candidates that are running for office. Clearly, Xochitl Galvez has placed herself as much more pro-business. She's put a lot of focus on nearshoring. She's also talking about transforming Mexico's energy policies, sort of taking them somewhat back to what they were, in which there'd be more foreign investment allowed and so on. But she's mentioned that as a real priority. She talks about training human capital, having workers, with a better sort of educational preparation to take advantage of this nearshoring. She does talk a lot about security and the impact of organized crime on economic investment, which I think is something that is not often talked about by the government, but increasingly you do hear about the tremendous. I mean, there's been things like robbing of tractor trailers forever, but it just seems to be going to a level that we have not seen before. And as Enrique talked about, the extent of extortion and illegal businesses beyond drug trafficking, it's sort of becoming more and more evident in the economy. But at the moment, Xochitl is pretty far back in the polls. Of course, at this point in the election in 2018, AMLO was at 30%, if I'm not mistaken, and he won with 50, so things can move. But of course, he's still pretty popular. And Morena does run most of the state governments. It has a tremendous ability to get out the vote. So I think, Claudia certainly seems like the person likely to win at this point. She hasn't provided a lot of detail, in part, I think, because she wants to stick to AMLO as close as possible and sort of ride his coattails as much as she possibly can. She has, in private meetings, tried to send signals that she would be more pragmatic, more evidence-based. She's told journalism groups privately that she would be sort of less antagonistic. The one area where she has also talked about some differences are with green energy. She clearly is, has a PhD in environmental engineering. So it'll be interesting. She, of course, has had more exposure to the U.S., having lived in the U.S. as a postdoc. She has a lot of family in the U.S., which people don't talk about, but they're there. But she comes from the left of the party. She came into politics as a student activist. And of course, she will have to find ways to appeal to the left of the party and to basically, presumably, keep AMLO happy. So anyway, I think at the moment, really, what I hear constantly in Mexico is what a mystery she is. And I think it's going to be interesting if she wins to see how much space she has. My people close to her say she really wants to kind of be her own person and make her own mark. I do think, though, one of the biggest questions, to me, a bigger question even really than the election is, if she wins, can she hold together this coalition that AMLO knit together? He's a very savvy political operator in Mexico. I wouldn't say that about his foreign policy, but it's a tough act for her to follow politically. She's not known for being either charismatic or politically terribly savvy. So I think the Morena itself faces a real test of whether it can survive as a party. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now, truth in advertising. It was when I read the piece on the Cancun workers that Mary Beth had as a long piece in the Post that I decided I was going to draw her into this conversation, because I could see she was sort of looking at that level of things, and it would really create a diverse conversation. And I want to thank both of you for bringing these diverse issues. There's so much open here, so much to talk about. And I want to once again just open the floor to questions, comments, etc. Here. Oh, Alejandro, please.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, and I think I share with you your look at the Mexican labor market, and in a way the issue that you highlighted, that it seems that without a well-structured policy, and by this I mean that you have a good diagnosis, that you have objectives, and then you tell us through which instrument you're going to achieve those objectives. The AMLO administration, I think, generated outcomes in the labor market that are good and that Mexico needed. So I think the shift of the wage distribution to the right, it's important. I think wages in Mexico are extremely low compared to countries with a similar level of development. And I think that the concern about the inflationary impacts of the minimum wage were completely overblown. I mean, you were timid a little bit in saying that it didn't generate any inflationary impact. I mean, maybe it had some, but also the increase in the price of tomatoes might have an inflationary impact. And we don't say, whoa, with the tomatoes. No, so I think people made a lot of the potential negative impacts of an increase in the minimum wage, both on inflation and on employment. And it's very hard to claim that it has had either. And it has helped increase wages. I think what you mentioned. I mean, I would be a little bit more skeptical on the union issue. I think it's but that I would like to hear from you. I mean, in your reporting work, what you have heard, because I haven't spoken with a union representative in Mexico in 10 years. So in the sense that I think the legal changes are right, but I don't know in practice if we're really seeing a new generation of union leaders with more modern ideas, or we're just seeing a little bit what we're seeing in the corporate sector, that we are still a crony capitalist society, and the only thing is we're changing the crony capitalist, or they are the same, but they are responding to a different set of objectives. No, so maybe we're shifting from a set of corrupt leaders to another set of corrupt leaders, but maybe there's not much a new way to lead these unions. I don't know if that's happening. I mean, and I would be interested in knowing if you have seen that new unions forming, a new unions leader. No, we used to have the Napo, the Napito, and the Napote. No, that was the grandparent, the father, and then the son leading the same union. Are we still seeing that, or you see that those changes? And finally, I mean, I would like to see from. I mean, it's not that you were as assertive as Enrique, but you see. You seem to see the situation in Mexico more as a winding road in which a society searching for a democratic and a development model, etc. And we went one way, and now we're moving in another direction. In some dimensions, we might be moving backwards. In another directions, we might be moving forward, but that's a little bit, and that's more for John than me to say. I mean, how history is made. No? I mean, we don't move in a straight line going to. So while Enrique was saying, well, we are at a very discrete moment in Mexican history in which we can take a very important step backwards and jump into a different path that is pretty bad. So what do you see on that spectrum of views on what is at stake at the June election in Mexico?
Thank you. So I think that it's fair to be skeptical and not see the union changes as completely sweeping. So as you know, there has been a fairly the reforms that went through the Mexican Congress have not only allowed workers to choose their own unions, but there's a whole new setup of labor courts that are seen as more independent. Having said all that, the mechanism, the rapid response mechanism that has been used now around 20 times or so, it is only applicable to export industries, right? So there are, of course, huge parts of the Mexican economy that can't work in. And obviously it's 20 cases, which is, not that many. It has set, though, I think it's gotten a lot of attention and created a real sort of, conversation. I think you still have a lot of unions that are run in a very traditional way. I mean, the Petroleum Workers Union is still electing the same people as ever, and I think still kind of riddled by corruption. And I think that, there was a provision in which tens of thousands of companies were supposed to reevaluate their collective bargaining agreements by like May of last year, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure I think something like 400 of them got thrown out. So, it's a small thing, or it's a change that I think is still taking time to work out. And I think there's still allegations in different places that companies try to pay off workers or threaten them. But I do think the fact that some of these high profile cases have won has, I think, particularly in the auto sector, which is so big and has really been one of the main areas where they've used these rapid response mechanisms. You do see, I think you see an effect. I think things are changing, but I would not suggest they're sort of that this is the majority by any means. And I think sometimes unions like the Crocs see it to their benefit to champion something that, Morena likes. The party is more or less pro-labor. They're sort of drawing more of a line probably with some of the employers, and they do. At least my conversations were that in that union, they talk about needing to really ensure that they're appealing to workers and that the workers are going to stay with them and choose them. And when they vote for their leader, it's going to be, the guy who's there right now. So I see change, but I think it is there's a lot of old practices still in place. In terms of, what's at stake in the next election, I think that the reforms that have been put forward by AMLO recently are really, to me, pretty more radical than most of what he's done during his presidency. I mean, getting rid of all the autonomous institutions, popularly electing judges, these seem to be really rather, they go much farther. Now, he doesn't have a majority right now, a supermajority to pass those in Congress. I'm not sure Claudia is going to have a supermajority either. And I do just wonder about her ability to hold the party together. It's not that I think the opposition is necessarily going to emerge from the election with some great renewed strength, but I do think that things may shift. I think there's just a lot we don't know yet because we really don't know how much, we don't know how good AMLO's health will be, how much he will, when and where he'll try to exert his influence if she wins, how much she may have sort of learned. I do think also she's going to face a certain number of problems that I think have been kicked down the road, if she wins, that is. I think the energy agreement, the energy dispute in USMCA, I think she's going to have to resolve it, and she also, again, I mean, we'll see, but she's quietly reached out to business people saying that she would see a role for more foreign investment because she does champion green energy and, where's the money going to come from to both expand, the electrical grid and to invest in new systems. I mean, she does make a big deal out of her pragmatism and her evidence-based, approach. What's interesting is she's quite a micromanager. So I have a feeling she might get into this really, she makes a big deal out of how she designed the COVID vaccine program for the city of Mexico on her laptop. I mean, she really likes the details. So anyway, I think that, and I think similarly with corn, it's going to, if the panel actually gets to a conclusion, they're going to rule against Mexico. And I think that they're going to, I actually think people in the government right now sort of quietly acknowledge that they can't win that case. And they're going to have to do something to, protect heirloom corn and so on, but they're probably not going to be able to win it. So I think she is going to be a little more, she's going to have to solve some of these problems. And she may have less, in some ways, baggage than AMLO because she just comes from a different not much of a different generation, but I think she's a bit more sort of a bit less tied to some of the kind of, past kind of shibboleths of the left, maybe.
Such quiet. Yes, Roberta.
Well, I'm sorry to contradict your last comment, but she comes from the left. She didn't even go through the PRI. All her life, she has been a political activist in all the causes that have gone against the system, beginning with the 68, which she prouds so much of being a representative, and how she grew up going with her parents to jail to visit their friends who were jailed. I mean, apparently, I don't know her personally, but apparently she grew up in a lab of a very small group of academics, very far left, with no practical knowledge of how the world works or how business works or how the real economy works. As far as I know, the time she was at Stanford, she never enrolled in any classes. She worked in a lab, I don't know in what capacity or for how long, but she didn't want to compete in the US system. She didn't want to take any exams or, it's very difficult to get into graduate school in the United States. but she didn't want to interact with that system. And her most famous moment at Stanford was bringing up a big card against Salinas when he visited, saying, "We want fair trade." I mean, she was totally against free trade, and she put her body to prove it. So I don't see AMLO as being a leftist. He is a stalwart of the PRI, and he has reproduced now what he learned of the PRI into Morena. Morena is now very much what the old PRI was, a corporativist party driven by a leader, which he pretends to be and which he pretends to continue to be. And when I hear all this optimism about Sheinbaum being able to kick him off as previous Mexican presidents or leaders did with their predecessors, there's a strong difference in terms that he will still hold the reins, as you mentioned, of holding together that very authoritarian party. And it's thanks to a great extent to his charisma, which she openly lacked. So I tend to 100% agree with Enrique Cárdenas and take her as face value, as what she says openly and not as what the people who are trying to help her to sweeten her deal talk to journalists or businessmen. But of course, this is only a point of view.
No, I think it's a really interesting question right now. Yeah, she definitely grew up on the left. You're totally right about that. And I think when people talk about her upbringing and her family's involvement with some of these great traditional leaders of the left, like one of the ideas is that that I've heard is that their whole vision of her family was that vision of the left in which you follow the leader, very obediently, right? So the idea that she has stayed so close to AMLO is partly presumably because she'd like to be president, but also sort of that was their formation, that while the leader is in power, you follow that leftist leader, right? I think that, so in terms of her education, she did a postdoc, from what I understand, at Stanford. I think she was there in part because her husband was studying there, from what I've heard. I just think that she is a conundrum because she hasn't really ventured, in public. She obviously wants to, and people are kind of almost embarrassed sometimes. I mean, she literally is almost kind of a puppet sometimes. I mean, that she literally changes her voice, people think, or talks in this very slow way that he does. I mean, it's almost sort of weird. So I think one of the questions is, how and where does AMLO choose to exercise his influence? He's obviously put a lot of his own people all over the place. And already we've seen in things like her wanting to have her security chief of Mexico City become the candidate for Morena for Mexico City, basically it's seen as AMLO basically said no. And her candidate, even though he won the most votes in the primary, was deemed not to be the favored one. So AMLO has a control that he exercises throughout the party. But I think she will be walking somewhat of a tightrope. I mean, she will not want to alienate his base. She won't want to trigger any sort of open attempt to revoke her presidency, if she is president, of course. But I also think that it's not, I don't see AMLO as sort of wanting to be a chaos agent. I don't see him as his success. He wants her to succeed. Presumably, he has mentored her and nurtured her, and so I'm not sure how much he would actually use some of those tools. And I guess I just think one of the real questions about AMLO was how would he, as president, be the kind of pragmatist he was as Mexico City mayor? And I think a lot of people would say he was not. He's not as pragmatic as he was. I mean, she's been a pretty pragmatic city mayor who, from everything I've heard, very much prides herself on her scientific background and has a perhaps less, I don't know, emotional, perhaps attachment to some things. Like, I don't know, her relations with Cuba. I don't think they're going to change dramatically, but I don't think she has that kind of same, you know, sort of, I think she's got a slightly different sense of nationalism. And I think that is reflective of her generation, despite the fact that they were formed by 68. Her parents obviously were at that demonstration in 68, managed to leave before the shooting began. But I don't know, I guess when going back to the start of my speech, when I came back to Mexico and people were like, what looks different to you? Like, I was struck by how much nationalism has changed. I mean, I just think there's a different discourse today than there was in the 90s. And I don't, even though she's certainly of the left, and she will have to keep the left happy, right? I mean, that's an important part of that coalition. I'm just not sure she's going to have the same approach as AMLO.
Well, just to stop at one point that is very dear to my heart, which is Cuba. I was a Mexican ambassador to Cuba. Her first act of public act after she was designated the candidate was to gather the Grupo de Puebla in Mexico City, which is something AMLO never did. AMLO never met with the Grupo de Puebla as president. I know he pulled the strings underground, but he didn't do it. And that was her first public activity. And she had not come to the United States, which apparently she will not, because there's a period, and if she doesn't come before March 1st, she will not come. Her only act concerning the United States was to stand before the border and say that she will have a relation of dignity, whatever that means, with the United States. So yes, I take her at face value.
Yeah, I mean, I just would say, I mean, obviously she is not going to abandon the leftist sort of principles that, you know, came out of the PRD and so on. I just don't think she's as sort of, I just think AMLO's attachment to Cuba was a very deeply emotional one that I'm not sure she'd have. And as far as the US, I think, you know, she's also appeared before groups in Mexico City of, like, you know, business executives who do business with the US, and talked about how much she's not given many details about what her policies would be vis-a-vis the US, but I mean, she also does say, I mean, that she seeks closer ties and, you know, wants to work constructively, et cetera. I mean, she's sort of not, I don't think she's projecting a purely negative message. I think it's kind of vague, but yeah.
Victoria.
Thank you. I wanted to, if we can, shift back a little to the issue of labor unions. There have been multiple allegations of union leaders pressuring or threatening their workers into attending shame bomb rallies, actually. And so I'm curious to think what the labor union's impact will be on the elections per your perspective, and also what unions can or can't do in terms of reinforcing echoes of the old PRI structure in Morena.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, some of the connection between the USMCA and the trade treaty and labor, most of the provisions about labor only apply to export industries. So I think you'll see something like the teachers union probably turning out a lot of people for shame bomb, I assume. And, you know, the oil workers union, probably the traditional unions. I would be surprised if there was a lot of change in those areas. I mean, you know, there's certain unions the government has obviously formed close alliances with. I mean, the teachers union obviously being one of them. So I think that is a very traditional relationship that, yeah, I don't see that changing at all. And I think that they'll continue to sort of behave the way they have.
Yes, Maria.
Hello. My name is Maria. I am Professor Titino's daughter. I also have a master's degree from MSFS, class of 07, right up in the top of the building next door. And I spent some time working with Angela at the Center for Latin American Studies. I am married into a Mexican middle-class family from Mexico City, and I spend part of each year living in Mexico and part of each year living here. I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room, but I probably do spend a little more time with, we'll say, working class, middle class, and poorer Mexicans who don't have access to elite spaces like this discussion we're having today. So first, I'd really like to thank you for bringing the conversation around to the common good, since, of course, trade that doesn't benefit the regular people is just reinforcing oligarchy. I guess I would like to ask, what do you think, which of these people do you think is going to look out for the people of Mexico more? You talked about some of the things they've done. There's also been the universal income supports that have been put in place for senior citizens, students, children, the poor. And I just read recently, though I think not in your newspaper, that they basically about 1 million Mexicans have been lifted out of poverty each year during the AMLO administration. And I can say we were there for several months this summer and fall. And when you speak with people who support Morena, those are the things that they care about. They feel that they're financially more secure, better off, less close to the edge poverty-wise. Now, I understand that's not all of Mexico. The pillar of anecdotes is not data, et cetera. But when people here just can't understand why people would support Morena, I get the impression that there's a real fear that Xochitl is not going to follow through on the 40-hour work week. Xochitl is not going to continue raising the minimum wage. Xochitl might pull those basic income supports. Are those, well-founded fears, or is that a PR issue? Who do we think is going to actually take care of regular people?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So Xochitl has promised to maintain the social programs. Obviously, some of the campaign against her is she's going to yank your benefits, and she says, no, I won't. I think, one of the big questions is the sustainability of some of those programs, just because the weight in the budget is so big, especially the pensions, very popular. And honestly, I think, there's a fair number of seniors who have been rescued from poverty because they have this payment. I think that there's a sense that those are, I think, fairly effective in addressing poverty. I think there's a lot more questions about some of the other, Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro and things like that, some of those programs, whether they're actually very effective. It's super interesting because, to me, if you look at AMLO's popularity numbers, they've maintained pretty high. Now, obviously, Mexican presidents tend to be popular, except for Peña Nieto, who seemed to have skipped over him. But, they tend to have ratings at the end of their presidencies, 50, 60%. That's been common for the last 4 or 5 presidents, at least. But when you look at the numbers on individual issues, AMLO's security policies poll really badly. And then you have issues like health. People have, there's been a real debate about the numbers with people being lifted from poverty, because, as you probably, Enrique, could explain better than I could, but there's different indices and different ways of measuring. And it turns out, maybe income goes up, but you've lost health benefit. Essentially, the health system has kind of really taken a dive under this government. So the measures are hard to, it's sort of harder than it looks to figure out what's going on with poverty. I do think, though, that it's clear that he has lifted many people out of poverty, whether it's minimum wage, some of the social programs, or other things. So I guess it comes down to, so who would be looking out for sort of the working person? I'm sure Claudia's message is probably much more directed to poor and working class Mexicans, but I think part of what AMLO is popular partly because he did have some policies that people have seen benefits in their own lives, right? I think part of it is just he's managed to project a sense that he cares about people. He's folksy, he's funny, he's irreverent, he's plain spoken. He travels the country endlessly, and he's always stopping to eat a taco or greet somebody's mom, and he's got that wonderful touch, really, that is I think it's, he's been very effective in the Mañanera. He controls the discourse practically. That doesn't necessarily translate into benefits, but I do think that in a country where a lot of poorer people felt they were excluded from the discourse of politics, I think that's also been huge. I don't think Claudia is going to be able to achieve that because if she's president, because she just doesn't come from, she doesn't have his experience. She doesn't have his kind of charisma, as somebody pointed out. So I don't know the answer to that. And I think, Xochitl does have, of course, this rather compelling story rising from, humble origins. So while she is certainly much more from, the business sector and I would say more aimed at the middle class, I guess, her message. She might be quite different from what we might have had with a Santiago Creel, for example, what more traditional panista candidate.
Yeah, Alejandro?
Given that Enrique, I thought he might have also come and try to take a shot at that comment that I think I think many of us would be fully supportive of an aggressive, rational center-left agenda for Mexico, no? And a much wider social coverage that balances cash transfers with improving the coverage and the quality of public services, with a rational way of financing this, making them sustainable in the medium term, and at the same time with allowing the private sector to do its work in a predictable environment. So, for example, I think strengthening and widening different social programs, I think it's fine. I think even Xochitl will agree, or other people from the opposition would agree. Politically, nobody will take them out because it's political suicide. Now, even if they don't agree with the program at the end, it's very hard to take them out. But for example, my personal opinion, if you move, there's a discussion whether you want to have targeted social programs where you targeted the 40% poorest segments of the population, or to go to a much more untargeted scheme. And I'm not really an expert on that, and I can not seriously weigh in on that discussion. But what I do think is if you're going to move to a more untargeted system, that it's a little bit where we move to in Mexico, at least do a tax reform where you tax the rich a little bit more, because there's a lot of mistakes in your transfers because people from the highest income decile are receiving transfers or subsidies that in such a unequal society they should not be receiving. So if you're going to go to a system in which you're going to have more errors in identifying who gets transfers and programs, tax them more. And in a way, you see all these contradictions. No, I mean, they didn't go for a tax reform. They didn't go, I mean, they didn't strengthen the antitrust commission. I think you can improve the income of the poorest Mexicans by as much as the most effective social programs, by really significantly reducing the market power of several oligopolies in the Mexican economy. So by strengthening the antitrust commission, you actually go through a market institutional mechanism where you generate more competition, even more investment, more jobs, and at the same time, you lower the prices of things that the poorest Mexicans consume more. And I think that's a little bit what has been lacking in this government, not the objective of supporting the population or the poorest segments of the population more. And then the way you address, let's say, the other part of the distribution, and let's call it going after the rich and the rapacious corporates. I think you should do it under an institutional and predictable way. So in a way, I mean, if you have an antitrust commission, if you have regulation that is being discussed and is passed by Congress, etc., you go after them with the objective of curtailing their market power. You don't do it through a decree overnight, because the problem of doing it through a decree overnight is that somebody that maybe was thinking on investing in another area does not understand the rationale for going after you. Then that person says, I will not go and invest in Mexico because I don't know if I'm going to be taxed next. So I think that's a little bit what people, or some people, other people want to keep their privileges, and I fully agree with you. But I think there's some rash, sensible policy analyst that says we would like to see many of these objectives that are being pursued in a different way that is more sustainable, that is more predictable, and obviously that doing that does not destroy the institutions that make these policies more predictable and more sustainable. I think that would be kind of a compromise in these views, and I'm not. I mean, taking from your question, I think there's even a concern in social wins to think that, I mean, the way things were done in the past was the right way. I think that would be the right lesson of an electoral victory of the opposition front. It will be that there are many reasons why AMLO won, why AMLO it's in power and it's relatively popular, and there will be many reasons if his candidate ends up losing. But it's not that the Mexican population goes to go back to Peña Nieto or to Felipe Calderón. They want something different, and the Mexican society has to look for that, no, and actually achieve that. I think that equilibrium.
Thanks.
I mean, going along the same direction as Alejandro, I think the question of distribution, the need for a better distribution is out of the question. Of course, it is something which is absolutely needed. I think a word that has become a bad word in Mexico is efficiency. And that's terrible. I mean, it has been politicized to the point where doing things right is not important. And I think this is really what this new election has to do with. If we can have an efficient government that really improves the cake so that you can distribute better the cake, I think it will help a lot.
Thanks. I'm going to step in here and say, first of all, the reception is ready, and it may be time for take advantage of Georgetown's redistributional capacities to share some bits of the wealth here. I do want to jump in. I want to thank everybody, and I'm going to make a bit of an observation at the end. One is, what strikes me most is the mix of these presentations have made it so clear how Mexico is not only living a historical moment, but a moment laden with contradictions. And then on the one hand, we have this conversation about the demand for democracy and redistribution, people appreciating things are getting better and liking those who are doing that and want to continue it. We have this parallel and the dynamism in the economy. The formal economy has some real dynamism in it. At the same time, we have this conversation about this other economy, this world of violence. My first thing goes through my mind is, what if actually the numbers from that economy could be folded into the numbers of the formal economy? God knows what a booming economy this might be. I don't know that I want to continue it. But those two things are going on in parallel. And the fact that they're happening in parallel and simultaneously is going to affect Mexico going forward in ways I'm not sure any of us can fully predict and understand. I'll just say that. And then I will say, on the political conversations, the upside is we're sitting here and it's March, and we're going to get the beginning of an answer in June. So there's going to be a lot of emerging clarity. We're going to know who wins, and we're going to start to see the outcomes, though they won't happen immediately. And I guess my last semi-cynical historian's comment is going to go something like this. If we heard the conversations in 1932-33, everyone was certain that Lázaro Cárdenas was Calles' puppet. Was Calles' puppet. And he would continue to do everything Plutarco Elias Calles had imposed in Mexico. It took him a year and a half. It took him 2 years. He got Calles out of politics. He got him out of the country. He got him into exile. And of course, the global depression had something to do with the ability for all that radical change to happen. And God forbid, I do not wish on either a global or a hemispheric depression to come on to anyone. But I guess I want to conclude by saying we're going to learn what we can learn pretty quickly. And boy, are there lots of things we're going to have to wait and see. We're not going to know. But again, I want to thank our presenters. I want to thank all of our participants, and I want to welcome you to the refreshments, and the conversations can carry on over refreshments. Thank you both, really. That worked wonderfully.